Thank you all for joining. We're just having people come into the Zoom room, and we're going to give a couple minutes for all of our attendees to join. So I have a fair number rolling in. Give it just another second. Okay. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Ryan Albert with EPA's Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water. Thank you for making time to join us to talk about this important proposal to National Primary Drinking Water Regulation for PFAS. We are starting the webinar now, and it is being recorded. It will be made available online in the near future. The purpose of today's webinar is to provide an overview of the proposal. Please go to our webpage. It will be discussed throughout the presentation today. It has the pre-publication Federal Register notice and several of the key technical support documents, including the MCLG derivation support documents and the economic analysis. We have today's briefing, which is designed to be a broad overview of the proposed regulation. There will be a more technical briefing on March 29th that will provide more detailed information about the various technical aspects of the proposal and the supporting analyses. We will not be taking questions today. However, we will be holding a public hearing on May 4th, and importantly, we will be opening a docket and soliciting comments or requesting comments as part of that docket. Please submit any input you have on this proposed regulation to the docket. This is a proposal, and we very much value the input that our stakeholders provide, that you will provide, and we will consider that prior to finalizing this regulation. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Rob Willis, who's going to provide a little bit of logistical information, and he will be followed by Jennifer McLean and Alex Land to talk about the substance of the proposal. Thank you.
Next slide, please. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Rob Willis, and I plan to spend the next 2 minutes describing how to access real-time captioning. For meeting participants that would like or need captioning, captioning is available in English, Spanish, French, traditional Chinese, simplified Chinese, Taiwanese Mandarin, Gujarati, Japanese, and Vietnamese. You can access the captioning by following the URL on the slide, and that was put into the chat. If you follow this URL, it will open up a separate window where the captioning will appear. It's at this window where you will have the option to choose a language. I'm going to give meeting participants just 1 moment to access the captioning before I continue. Please note that to best accommodate the live captioning, we are asking speakers to proceed slowly. Buenos días o buenas tardes para los participantes de este webinar que desean o necesitan subtítulos en español. Los subtítulos cerrados están disponibles en inglés y en español, y también en otros idiomas. Para llegar a los subtítulos en español, siga el URL en el PowerPoint o en el chat. Si sigues este URL, una ventana separada donde tendrá la opción de subtítulos en español. Los subtítulos aparecen en esta ventana. Voy a dar un momento para las personas que necesitan subtítulos antes de continuar. Durante el resto de este webinar, ya no estaré traduciendo. As you see, there's also a QR code on the screen. If you want to access captioning on your mobile phone while watching the webinar, you can scan this QR code on the screen and it'll open up the captioning window on your mobile device. Jennifer, I'm going to give attendees just another few more minutes to set up the captioning, and then I'm going to turn it right over to you to kick off the meeting. Okay, Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you to everyone for joining us today on this webinar. We have an important proposed action that we want to describe to you today. As you know, the agency has proposed a national primary drinking water regulation for 6 PFAS chemicals. It's important that we stay centered on the fact that this is a proposed rule. We are looking forward to hearing feedback on the proposed rule from states and communities, industry, advocacy groups, and other stakeholders and individuals over the next 60 days following the publication of the proposed rule in the Federal Register. And this is through our usual rulemaking process. No actions are needed by states or water systems at this time. So I'm going to be giving a big picture overview of the proposed regulation, and then I'm going to turn it over to Alex Land from the Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water here at EPA to go a little bit deeper into what is in the rule. So starting with the why are we doing this? Safe drinking water is fundamental to healthy people and thriving communities. We all rely on water from the moment that we wake up to make a cup of coffee to when we brush our teeth at night. Every person should have access to clean and safe drinking water. That's why EPA is acting now to protect people's drinking water from PFAS contamination. The science is clear. Long-term exposure to certain PFAS is linked to significant health risks. People can be exposed to PFAS in several ways. When their drinking water is contaminated with PFAS, it can be a significant portion of a person's total PFAS exposure. And that's why reducing exposure by taking actions like regulating drinking water with maximum contaminant levels for PFAS can lower our risk for negative health effects. I want to underscore that this action marks a public health milestone and a fundamental commitment in the agency's PFAS strategic roadmap. EPA is taking a key step to protect public health by proposing to establish legally enforceable levels for 6 PFAS known to occur in drinking water. We're taking our role as the lead federal agency responsible for ensuring safe drinking water seriously, and we're putting people's health front and center. EPA is using the most recent science as the backbone to this proposal, and we're building on the terrific efforts that many states have made to limit PFAS. So the proposal, what does it say? If finalized, this National Primary Drinking Water Regulation proposal will regulate PFOA and PFOS as individual contaminants, and it will regulate 4 other PFAS, which are called PFNA, PFHxS, PFBS, and GenX Chemicals as a mixture. There are 4 key things about the proposed rule that I want to go over. First of all, EPA is proposing to set limits by regulating PFOA and PFOS at the level at which they can be reliably measured, which is 4 parts per trillion. EPA is also proposing that water systems monitor for these 4 other PFAS that I just mentioned that are known to occur in drinking water. And I'll say them again. That's PFNA, PFHxS, PFBS, and GenX Chemicals. For these PFAS, water systems would use a hazard index calculation to determine if the combined levels of these PFAS exceed the limit and pose a potential risk to human health. Monitoring and public notification is the next component of the proposed rule. The regulation would require public water systems to monitor for these chemicals and to notify the public if the levels of these PFAS exceed the proposed regulatory standards. And then treatment or other actions to reduce PFAS. So the proposal would require that public water systems reduce the levels of these PFAS in drinking water if the levels exceed the proposed regulatory standards. If finalized, this new rule will significantly result in less PFAS in drinking water across the United States. We understand that reducing PFAS in drinking water will likely require investments in water infrastructure. And we recognize that that could be a concern for many. At the federal level, we've been making unprecedented investments in infrastructure and specifically for emerging contaminants. There are billions of dollars available through the bipartisan infrastructure law to help communities upgrade drinking water systems with technologies that remove PFAS. The bipartisan infrastructure law provides $9 billion to invest in drinking water systems impacted by PFAS and other emerging contaminants. And it's really important to acknowledge the work that has already been done at the state and local level to manage PFAS exposure. We commend the many states that have led the way in monitoring for and establishing guidelines and even state standards for PFAS in drinking water. This proposed rule complements those actions and builds on them by incorporating public health concerns, the latest science, feasibility, and costs into a proposed national rule. I want to close by emphasizing that exposure to PFAS has and can result in negative health impacts, and EPA is committed to following through on actions related to PFAS that protect public health and reduce exposure. This action is a cornerstone of EPA's whole of agency approach that's outlined in our PFAS strategic roadmap. We are going to continue to work with federal, state, territorial, and tribal governments and drinking water systems to address concerns about PFAS in drinking water and solutions to reduce human health risks. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Alex Land to provide further background on today's briefing.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer, for the introductions and welcome. Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Land with EPA's Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water, and I'm currently one of the technical leads for this rulemaking effort. On behalf of our team here at EPA, I'd like to extend my appreciation for you all joining today. I am very excited to have this presentation with you and hope to be able to share our perspectives on PFAS in drinking water and to be able to talk through some of the details of the proposed rule. We have a lot to cover, so let's just go ahead and jump right into it. Next slide, please. So let's start with a brief background on per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. First, it's important to note that PFAS are a group of manufactured chemicals that have been used in many industrial and commercial applications for decades. PFAS are often called forever chemicals because one trait that's generally common across this group of compounds is that they are very persistent in the environment, which means that they are designed to be stable and non-reactive because of the applications in which they are used. So for example, PFAS are commonly used as stain and water repellents in clothing, carpets, and other consumer products. Because of this, manufacturers and producers generally do not want to lose that waterproof characteristic over time. Another example is that PFAS are also commonly used in certain types of firefighting foams. And similarly, these users may want these foams to be stable for that intended use. All that to say is that there are many examples for why this characteristic make them useful for many industrial or commercial applications and manufacturing processes. But the thing to understand here is that the more stable and non-reactive it is for their application, the longer these compounds can persist in the environment, meaning that they break down slowly and can ultimately build up in people and in animals in the environment over time. And these fundamental challenges on persistence, along with the diversity and number of potential compounds in this family, I think reflects the environmental and public health challenges that we face with respect to these compounds. Although some PFAS have been phased out of use in the United States, they may still be found in the environment and in drinking water. Next slide, please. Since PFAS don't readily degrade and can accumulate in the human body, current scientific research and available evidence have shown potential for harmful human health effects after being exposed. Examples here include effects on pregnant people and developing babies, immune effects that weaken the body's ability to fight disease, increased risk to certain types of cancers and liver effects, and elevated cholesterol levels, which can increase your risk for heart attack and stroke. Drinking water is one of several ways that people can be exposed to PFAS, and our examination of drinking water data showed that different PFAS can be found together and in different combinations as mixtures. That is why the agency is moving forward with this proposed regulation and acting to protect our drinking water by reducing our exposure to PFAS, which can lower our risk to these adverse health effects. Next slide, please. So let's spend a few minutes to talk through the core provisions in this proposed rule. But first, through this action, EPA is proposing what's called a National Primary Drinking Water Regulation, which will establish legally enforceable maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs, for 6 PFAS found in drinking water. The proposed regulation will establish MCLs for 2 of the most widely studied PFAS, PFOA, or PFOA, and PFOS, or PFOS. The proposed regulation will also establish an MCL for 4 compounds as a mixture. And again, that is PFHxS, PFNA, PFBS, and HFPO dimer acid, commonly known as GenX Chemicals. In this action, EPA is also proposing health-based maximum contaminant level goals, or MCLGs, for these 6 PFAS. MCLGs are non-enforceable and represent public health goals that are set at a level at which there are no known or anticipated negative health effects and allowing for a margin of safety. Next slide, please. This slide provides a summary of the proposed non-enforceable public health goals and proposed enforceable limits for these compounds. Based on EPA's evaluation of current best available science, PFOA and PFOS are found to be likely human carcinogens, which means that they can cause cancer in humans. So the proposed health goals are 0 for both PFOA and PFOS. Based on current analytical capabilities and available treatment technologies, EPA is proposing a legally enforceable MCL at 4.0 parts per trillion each for PFOA and PFOS. For the other 4 compounds, the proposed MCLG and MCL for the 4 additional PFAS is based on the hazard index approach, which is a tool that is commonly used to evaluate potential health risks from exposure to mixture of contaminants. This hazard index approach recognizes the fact that many PFAS share common health endpoints and are known to co-occur in the environment as mixtures. I'm sure many of you may have questions on what the hazard index is and how it's applied. So let's spend a few minutes to talk through this approach. Next slide, please. As I mentioned previously, our evaluation of scientific evidence and drinking water occurrence data show that many PFAS share common health endpoints and can co-occur in the environment as mixtures. And the hazard index itself is a tool that's used to understand and evaluate health risks from exposure to mixtures of contaminants. EPA's proposed approach for PFNA, GenX Chemicals, PFHxS, and PFBS uses the hazard index, which considers the combined toxicity of these compounds. So how does this all work? The hazard index at its most basic core is made up of a sum of fractions, also called hazard quotients. The calculation compares your exposure, meaning the level of each PFAS measured in water, to a level where health effects are not anticipated. If I can direct your attention to the graphic on the bottom left, you calculate the hazard index by first dividing the measured concentration of each of the 4 PFAS against its health-based value. The bottom red numbers represent the health-based value for each of the 4 compounds. So you would divide the measure value of GenX over 10 parts per trillion, measure value of PFBS over 2,000 parts per trillion, measure value of PFNA over 10 parts per trillion, and then the measure value of PFHxS over 9 parts per trillion. After you calculate the individual ratios, you'll add them together to produce the hazard index value. Now, to determine compliance with the MCL, you'll repeat these steps for each sample collected in the past year, average those hazard index values to determine what's called the running annual average. If this running annual average is greater than 1, then you are in violation of the proposed MCL, and further action must be taken to reduce these levels in your drinking water. To assist in the calculation of these values, the agency is developing a calculator tool to easily determine your hazard index results. Next slide, please. There are other important provisions in the proposal that I want to highlight. The proposed rule, when finalized, will also require public water systems to routinely monitor for these compounds in drinking water, provide notification to their consumers on the levels of these PFAS, and reduce the levels of these PFAS in drinking water if they exceed the proposed standards. EPA is requesting comment on all aspects of the proposed rule. And later in this presentation, I will talk about how you can engage in the public comment process. We are also requesting comment on the agency's preliminary determination to regulate the 4 additional PFAS and their mixtures. I want to reiterate and be very clear that this action is a proposal for public comment. It is not final and currently does not require any actions until EPA has considered the public's input and finalizes the regulation. Once finalized and fully implemented, the agency expects the rule will prevent tens of thousands of serious PFAS-related illnesses and deaths. Next slide, please. So I want to spend a few minutes to talk about the economic analysis that we've developed for this proposed rule. The agency uses the economic analysis as an important source of information in evaluating the impacts of our policies, which I will briefly summarize here, starting with the national benefits and then costs. With anticipated national benefits, EPA has quantified the health benefits that are expected from the proposed rule, which includes reduced cases of kidney cancer, heart attacks, strokes, and developmental effects such as low birth weight in newborns. EPA estimates that the annualized quantified benefits to fall between $908 million to $1.23 billion per year, depending on the discount rate. I want to also highlight that the agency also expects significant additional benefits beyond those we were able to quantify from the other health effects that's listed in the second bullet, such as immune effects, other developmental and cardiovascular effects, liver disease, other types of cancers, among others. What's important to note here is that these non-quantifiable health risk reduction benefits are anticipated to be substantial. Next slide, please. The cost analysis primarily deal with estimating the expenses needed to comply with the drinking water regulation, which includes costs associated with administration, monitoring, and treatment, as well as primacy agency costs associated with rule implementation and administration. The agency expects that the roughly 66,000 public water systems will be subject to the rule, and between 3,400 to 6,300 systems are expected to exceed one or more of the proposed MCLs. Public water system treatment costs. These estimates include expected expenditures associated with capital and yearly operation and maintenance costs over the period of analysis. EPA estimates that the annualized quantified rule cost to fall between $772 million to $1.2 billion per year, depending on discount rate. Additionally, the agency has prepared a supplemental cost analysis that estimates an additional increase of $30 to $61 million per year if water systems are required to dispose of PFAS treatment media as hazardous waste. More information on this supplemental analysis and our economic analysis as a whole can be found and is available currently on our webpage and will be made available through the public docket, which I'll cover momentarily. In considering both costs and benefits of the proposed rule, the administrator has determined that the benefits of the proposed rule justify the costs. Next slide, please. As Jennifer mentioned earlier, reducing PFAS in drinking water will likely require investments in water infrastructure. That is why, through the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law, there are billions of dollars available to help communities upgrade drinking water systems with technologies that remove PFAS. The bipartisan infrastructure law provides $9 billion to invest in drinking water systems impacted by PFAS and other emerging contaminants. EPA is working to ensure that states, tribes, and localities get their fair share of this federal water infrastructure investment, especially in disadvantaged communities. These funds include $4 billion in investments through the Drinking Water State Revolving Funds, $5 billion in communities as grants through EPA's New Emerging Contaminants in Small or Disadvantaged Communities Grants Program. Next slide, please. Thank you all for bearing with me so far. I am nearing the end of my portion of the presentation, and we'll just spend the last few minutes talking about how you can submit comment on the proposed rule. As mentioned earlier, the public is invited to review EPA's proposal and supporting materials and to provide input to EPA through the public docket. The docket will open when the rule publishes in the Federal Register in the coming weeks. When the docket opens, it can be accessed at www.regulations.gov under the docket ID EPA-HQ-OW-2022-0114. Written comments must be submitted to the public docket within 60 days following publication in the Federal Register. And for more details and information on how to submit information, please visit the web link that's provided here. Next slide, please. As mentioned earlier, the agency is holding a series of informational webinars on the proposed rule itself. The general overview is provided through this webinar today, and a more technical overview aimed at water utilities and water professionals will be held on March 29th. During the public comment period, EPA will also hold a virtual public hearing to occur on May 4th. This public hearing provides an opportunity and forum to listen to verbal feedback from the public about the proposal itself. We highly encourage members of the public to register and attend the hearing. EPA will consider both written and oral public comments equally as the agency moves forward in developing the final regulation. Next slide, please. So again, please visit this link for full details on EPA's proposed rule. You'll find many resources on this page. And for now, I'd like to invite Dr. Ryan Albert to come in and say a few words to close out the webinar for today. Ryan, I'll pass the floor to you.
Thank you, Alex. And I'm glad we have the webpage listed here because I was not looking forward to reading that out to everyone. Once again, thank you everyone for joining us today. We know that the information contained in the rule that we've conducted an extent of scientific, engineering, and economic analyses for this rule, and it will be a lot for many of you all to look through. The information for the actual Federal Register notice and the information for the actual Federal Register notice and the economic analysis and MCLG documents are on this webpage, and the remaining information will be available in the docket when it publishes. As Alex and Jennifer alluded to, just reaffirming, I want to reaffirm that that this proposed rulemaking, that EPA is deeply committed to addressing PFAS contamination, and this proposed rulemaking is a cornerstone of the agency's whole of PFAS regulation approach. Please do submit comments to the docket for this particular action. This is how we formally consider input from the public. The comment period will be open for 60 days. Look forward to considering your comments prior to finalizing this regulation. Thank you for joining us today. For those of you who want more technical information, we'll look forward to seeing you on March 29th. And once again, the public hearing, the virtual public hearing will be on May 4th. Thank you very much.